Hey, so we have started a new series on the 1689 Baptist Confession on Wednesday nights, and we're trying to get everything recorded for this new YouTube channel that we've got. We've kind of had some technical difficulties the first few weeks, so I'm just going back and trying to fill in the gaps so that when we're going back and trying to look at this later on, that it's a complete series and we're not missing a few teaching sessions. So that being said, our first session is going to address two really major topics. Not really diving into the confession itself yet, but first asking two foundational questions. Why have a confession at all? Why? I mean, we can get into the exegesis of the confession, but first we need to know, why do we even need a confession? I mean, we have scripture. Why another document trying to tell us what Christian doctrine is? And then the next thing that we want to look at in this video is going to be kind of a brief overview, a very short, very brief overview of the historical situation which produced the 1689 Confession. Trying to kind of look at why the 1689 divines would have reached the conclusions that they penned into the confession, and then maybe evaluate the usefulness of the confession for us in our day. So that being said, let's get into our confession, or let's get into our lesson. A. Hodge, in his commentary on the Westminster Confession, identifies four reasons for confessionalism. And I want to try to go through these one by one and just kind of discuss them for just a moment. So the first reason for having a confession of faith is to mark, disseminate, and preserve the attainments made in the knowledge of Christian truth by any branch of the church in any crisis of its development. This can be seen clearly in the wording of the confession, and it was purposely done that way. You can see by the way that they did the doctrinal formulations, it's the same wording that came out of the ecumenical councils. Read the doctrine of the Trinity as written in our confession, or read the section in chapter 8 on the person and the two natures of Christ. All of this was purposely worded in such a way to show the unity that the 1689 divines had with not only the early church, but the church through the ages. So that's point number one. That's basically just to show our unity. This is not new. Our doctrine's not new. It goes all the way back to Christ and beyond. So point number two, made by A. Hodge for confessionalism, to discriminate the truth from the glosses of false teachers and to present it in its integrity and due proportions. Sam Waldron says in one of his books, and I'll get into that later, but he says, quote, "When men use the very words of the Bible to promote heresy, when the word of truth is perverted to serve error, nothing less than a confession of faith will serve publicly to draw the lines between truth and error," end quote. So the point there is to realize that it's not enough to simply say, well, we believe the Bible. And why is that not enough? Because every heretic under the sun has said the same thing. I think back, by way of example, I think back to the Arian controversy. The Arians claimed that they believed the Bible, and they tried to argue against the deity of Christ by using Scripture. When this is what made the Council of Nicaea necessary, because the doctrine had to be formulated in such a way that it showed that heresy was what it was, heresy, that it was not true, that it was not in accordance with Scripture. So confessions of faith help to, well, what Hodge said, discriminate the truth from the glosses of false teachers. And that's another, I like the way that he words it, where he says glosses, because there's usually nuance. whereas the truth is usually pretty straightforward. Heresy has layers, you know. But that's point number two for how a confession is helpful, is that it helps us to formulate doctrine in such a way as to delineate the truth from error. Number three, point number three that Hodge makes, to act as the basis of ecclesiastical fellowship among those so nearly agreed as to be able to labor together in harmony. And this is actually one of the primary reasons the 1689 divines wrote the confession in the first place. In the introduction to the confession, the divines said this, quote, "This we did the more abundantly to manifest our consent with," talking about it, their Presbyterian and Congregationalist brethren, "in all the fundamental articles of the Christian religion, as also with many others whose orthodox confessions have been published to the world on the behalf of the Protestant in diverse nations and cities," end quote. So, confessions of faith are really good for showing our unity with our brethren that are divided maybe on some doctrines, but are overall united with us in doctrine. And in the context, and we'll get into this in just a little while, but in the context of the Baptist divines that made the 1689 confession, that would be more specifically their Presbyterian and Congregationalist brethren. I think that this is one of the best reasons for using a confession of faith, because it shows not only diversity but unity, general unity with brethren from other denominations on the fundamental core doctrines of Christianity. Yes, we do have differences, but in general, we agree on the basics, on who is God, what is God, how are we saved, what did Christ accomplish when he was crucified, things like this that are basic to the faith. This confessions help to establish unity in those doctrines. Hodge's point number four, to be used as instruments in the great work of popular instruction. And this is the primary purpose of what we'll be doing in this series. Confession of Faith is designed to take the great truths of Scripture and systematize them in order to aid saints in better learning Christian doctrine. So, the doctrines are there in Scripture, whether we have a confession of faith or not. They're not, confessions of faith are not absolutely necessary, but they're helpful. As I said, the doctrines are there whether we have the confession of faith or not. However, it is a helpful teaching tool to be able to have those doctrines put together in an organized way. Whereas the Scriptures are in large measure written in letter form, especially the New Testament, are written in letter format. They were written to a specific people at a specific time for a specific purpose. They're not always organized according to doctrine. So it's helpful to be able to have those doctrines that are contained in the Scriptures to be put down in a systematic way for instructional purposes, for learning. And after all, the command of the Great Commission is that we make disciples, and a necessary part of fulfilling that command is the inculcation of Christian doctrine. Well, confessions of faith are perfect aids in teaching Christian doctrine. Sam Waldron, in his commentary on the 1689 Confession, which I highly recommend, by the way, but in his commentary on the 1689 Confession, he identifies two objections to confessionalism that I kind of want to look at real quick. Number one, confessions of faith undermine the sole authority of the Bible in matters of faith and practice. I'm going to begin by just saying this is simply not true. The 1689 Confession, along with the Westminster and the Savoy Confessions, all start by showing that the confessions themselves are based on Scripture, and they point back to Scripture. They do not, in and of themselves, claim to be the final authority or even another infallible authority on the same level as the Bible. They explicitly say otherwise. They explicitly state that the final authority in all matters of doctrine is the Scriptures alone. And so, in and of themselves, they point back to Scripture. So it can't be the case that they would undermine the sole authority of the Bible when they themselves point us to the Bible. And then the second objection, confessions of faith are inconsistent with liberty of conscience before God. So the idea there is that for a church to have a confession of faith is somehow interfering with the Christian liberty of its members. Well, what's the main problem with this? For your liberty to be infringed, someone has to force you to go along with something that you don't want to go along with. Well, who's forcing you to be a member of a church? We have the choice of whether or not we join churches. And if a church is what it should be, it will be upfront about its confessions. It'll be upfront about its doctrines before it will accept a new member. On the other side of that, prospective new members, if they are what they ought to be, will be upfront about their beliefs. So that it shouldn't be the case that anyone feels like they're being forced to go along with something that they don't agree with. And if doctrinal disagreements between prospective new members and the church are so great that it would go against the new member, the prospective new member's conscience to join that church, they shouldn't join the church. It's plain and simple. So no, confessions of faith do not in any way infringe the liberty of conscience before God. Now, in our own context, our confession helps to show unity and distinctives in multiple ways. Go through a few examples of these. Number one, it shows we agree with our Reformed brethren in opposition to dispensationalism in that we adhere to covenant theology. But it's no secret, I don't think, that the vast majority of Baptist churches in the United States today, and especially in our little area of the world in Bremen, Georgia, the vast majority of them adhere to dispensationalism. Our confession shows something else. It shows in that respect that we are united with our Reformed brethren and we are in disunity with our Baptist brethren. However, it shows our distinctive Baptist covenant theology as opposed to classical covenant theology with its view of household baptisms. So even though we are, in a sense, united to our Presbyterian and Congregationalist brethren, in that we do adhere to covenant theology, we have our own distinctive covenant theology. Theirs leads to infant baptism, and what they call the household principle, the idea that believers and their children should be baptized, whereas our view of covenant theology says that believers only, or I should say professing believers only, should be baptized. So our confession helps to delineate that. It shows our unity in Baptist principles with our general Baptist brethren. So while we might disagree with our Baptist brethren on dispensationalism, we do agree in the baptism of professing disciples alone. However, it also shows our distinctive way of getting to credo baptism through covenant theology, as well as our Calvinistic soteriology. So while we agree with our Baptist brethren, our dispensational general Baptist brethren, on the fact that we are to only baptize professing believers, we don't get there the same way. We get there based on an understanding of the covenants that they don't share. And part of that is our understanding of how men are saved, the nature of man, the nature of God, what exactly was accomplished on the cross, things like that. And then finally, our confession shows our distinctive view of church government in opposition to our Presbyterian and Episcopalian government structures. So, whereas those two structures are more of kind of like a top-down sort of government, we have more of a bottom-up sort of view. Local churches are able to govern themselves. They can and should join together in unity for common cause, for the spread of the gospel. They should give advice and consent to each other when that is requested, or perhaps even necessary otherwise. But in the final analysis, each local body rules itself, of course, under the headship of Christ, if it is a true biblical church. But we don't have a top-down structure where we have these other organizations telling churches what they can and can't do. As Baptists, as Congregational Baptists, we don't believe that. And so in that way, we're distinct from our Presbyterian and Episcopalian brethren. All right, so that kind of takes care of our first question, why confessionalism? So the remainder of this video, I'm going to try to briefly cover a little bit of history. The 1689 Baptist Confession was born out of the Puritanism of the 17th century. There were three primary branches of the movement. You had Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists, and by far, I think the Baptists were the minority, but they were part of it. Our confession is taken from, in addition to the Bible, it all points back to the Bible, but in addition to that, it's taken from four primary sources. You've got the First London Baptist Confession of 1644, the Westminster Confession of 1646, which is the Presbyterian Confession. You have the Savoy Declaration of 1658, which is the Congregationalist Confession, and then you have the 1689 Divine's own original work. From my studies, what I've read from people who have done a lot more research on this than me, it appears that the Savoy Declaration was the primary document which was used as the basis for the 1689 Baptist Confession, with language from the other three sources imported where necessary. According to Sam Waldron in his exposition of the 1689 Baptist Confession, only 14 out of the 160 paragraphs contained in the 1689 Confession are not derived from the Savoy. So a lot of agreement with our Congregationalist brethren from the past. The Savoy was an attempt by the Congregationalists to show agreement and divergence from the Presbyterians. And then the 1689 Confession takes the Savoy with its Congregationalist distinctives, because they did agree with us in general on church government, the bottom-up structure. It comes from an appendage to their declaration and not the declaration itself. However, broad agreement with the Congregationalists. But the 1689 adds Baptist distinctives, obviously, and that's what separated us from our Puritan Paedo-Baptist brethren. Presbyterians and Congregationalists both believe in infant baptism, and we don't. So thus, the 1689 Confession was written for the primary purpose of showing the broad agreement the English particular Baptists of the 17th century had with their Puritan Paedo-Baptist brethren, while also showing their distinctives. And a second related purpose was to show their distinction from the radical Anabaptists of their day. Most assuredly, we do not have Anabaptist roots, as so many general Baptists of our day like to claim. I've been told that I don't know how many times. Over, 20 years, I've been told, well, no, our roots are Anabaptist. We're not related to these Puritans. And it's usually some kind of way of trying to argue against Calvinistic soteriology. They try to demonize the Puritans, and all the way back to the Reformers even. Try to demonize Calvin. But basically it's because of a hatred for, or it seems to me anyway, I should be fair to them, but it seems to me that it is because of a hatred of the doctrines of grace. And that's no way to do Christian church history. The fact of the matter is, we are the theological descendants of the Reformers and the Puritans. And that's not something to run from. That's something to learn from. In most ways, I think that that's something to be thankful for. No, they weren't perfect. They did have erroneous views on some things, but generally speaking, these were solid followers of Scripture, believed in sola scriptura. They lived their lives showing they believed in sola scriptura. They loved the Lord. And you can tell that from the way they live their lives, and we can tell that from the writings that they've left behind for us. So, most definitely this is something we want to embrace, that we are the theological descendants of the Puritans and the Reformers. All right, so that about wraps up the first lesson, and we'll pick up with chapter 1 of the Confession in the next one.